This evening, we're going to talk about snowflakes. And yes, it's only September 18th. It was in the 80s today, and this coming week it's going to be in the 80s again. But today we're talking about snow. Winter is not really that far away. I told the kids last week that Christmas was only 105 days away. But since we're now a week removed from that, we're out of the triple digits in the Christmas countdown. But today we're not really talking about winter or Christmas yet. We're just talking about snowflakes and worshiping God and how the two are more alike than you might think. Now, if I came up to you today and told you that I needed you to plan out a worship service for me and everything in that service would be up to you to organize and put together, what are some of the things that you would immediately think to throw into your worship service? Now, of course, we'd have to choose some Bible verses to read, maybe 2, maybe 3. Then you would want someone to deliver a sermon that talks about those verses a little more in depth. Someone has to offer up a prayer or two. And then we'd need some music. We have to pass the offering plates. We need to have a call to worship that we say together. And how do you even write one of those? Here's a hint, you find them online. And then when you get it all together, what order do you put them in? Now, I would be willing to bet you that of all the churches you've been to, each one has had a slight variation on that formula. Maybe you've even been to a church that is majorly different than what you're used to. You may have even noticed that our worship services here have varied in between pastors, even of the same denomination. So what in the world are we supposed to do with this? What is that magic formula that takes some time out of our week and transforms it into a time of worshiping God? What is worship? As I was thinking about this question and how I wanted to approach answering it, I kept thinking about snowflakes. And I'm sure you've heard that no two snowflakes are alike, that every piece of white fluff that falls from the sky is never quite the same as the one that fell before it, and not quite the same as the one that falls after it. The why behind this fact is just about as interesting as the fact itself. Snow itself is really just groups of ice crystals that form in the atmosphere. As they fall to Earth, they are shaped and changed by a variety of factors, including temperature, wind, sunlight, and more. And since each snowflake varies ever so slightly on its way down to Earth, their shape becomes different. People have been so fascinated by snowflakes that they have studied them for centuries. In fact, the earliest known recording of the study of snowflakes comes from China all the way back in 135 BC. Back then, a Chinese scholar named Han Yin noted that flowers of plants and trees are generally 5-pointed, but those of snow, which are called ying, are always 6-pointed. Later, humans would discover that snowflakes don't even have to fall into that classic 6-point shape, that shape that we most often associate with snowflakes. In fact, some snowflakes are often divided into 2 categories: plates, which we are usually most used to, and columns, which can include things like thin, needle-like droplets, hollow shafts, solid prisms, and more. From the very shape of the snowflake to the intricate design of the crystals as they join together, there is a practically endless array of possibilities for each snowflake that falls from the sky. And aside from this being our example this evening about the possibilities of worship, it's also a beautiful testament to God about the intricacies and awe-inspiring breadth of His creation. But we are talking about worship tonight, and as we already said, I'm sure you've seen varying versions of worship in just about any church that you've attended, or even among different pastors at one church. Alice Childress, a novelist, playwright, and actress, once said, "Like snowflakes, the human pattern is never cast twice. We are uncommonly and marvelously intricate in thought and action." And I believe that. Do you? And if the answer is yes to that question, that we believe God has created us uncommonly and marvelously intricate in thought and action, then it really shouldn't be any surprise whatsoever that our styles of worship won't be quite the same. I'm afraid that some churches get lost in that formula of worship. And what I mean by that is that somewhere in the past, someone said, this is how we need to worship, and A leads to B, B leads to C, and then we end with X, Y, Z. And that's how it's been ever since. In that order, and woe to the person that ever says that maybe we could shake things up a little bit. Now, that's not to say that everything that we do on a weekly basis should be up for the chopping block. I believe that there are things we do in a regular worship service that deserve the respect, reverence, and awe that we give them. But on the other hand, we are creatures of habit, and sometimes those habits get in the way of true, meaningful worship. The very idea of what church should look like has changed a lot over the years. What we all grew up with isn't the same thing as what our children are growing up with. It's not even the same thing as what our ancestors grew up with. But different isn't always bad. We, for example, may experience church very differently from the first Christians, some of which may have even experienced Christ firsthand. Some of the earliest accounts of Christian gatherings, some even led by the disciples themselves, were probably modeled after other gatherings in the Roman world at the time. These probably did take place on Sundays, but they were often associated with a large meal together, followed by a time of singing, prayer, teaching, preaching, and more. In the book of Acts, we're told about a time when Paul spoke to the congregation until dawn. And if that is what worship is supposed to look like, being that it comes straight from Paul, we all better get comfortable because we've got some hours ahead of us. Oh, and during that service, Paul only stopped to raise someone from the dead. And while I haven't tried that yet, I guess I could give it the old college try. This may be obvious, but so many of the things that we take for granted today didn't even exist back then. They most likely met in private homes, while we have beautiful, elaborate buildings. Coincidentally, this is also true of some of our more recent ancestors that began churches just like this one by meeting in homes around the community just to have Bible studies together. Even some of the songs that we know and love today, some of the ones that we consider must-haves for worship, have only existed for a minuscule amount of time compared to the amount of time that Christians have been gathering together. There were over 1,700 years of Christians gathering and worshiping together, and nobody had ever heard of Amazing Grace until it was written in 1779. But enough about the past. Let's talk about church right now. It's safe to say that even in the last 2 years, church has changed drastically. Churches across the world had to get creative with how we offered worship to our members when we weren't not even able to open our doors. And some of that has actually stuck around. We here at Savannah had never recorded our sermons until 2020, and we're still doing that today. And every once in a while, I'm told of someone that I have never met that has seen our service online. We are reaching people in ways that we have never reached them before. Also in 2020, in Denver, North Carolina, a brand new church began operation. This church, named the Checkpoint Church, is a bit different than your normal church in that they don't even have a building. Their entire church exists solely online. Through a combination of live streaming and online community building platforms, Checkpoint Church has grown to around 100 active members, with live streams reaching as many as 450 people at one time. And if that's not quite different enough, maybe let's consider Messy Church. This is an initiative that started in the UK and has since spread to other countries, including the United States. And Messy Church is a creative, interactive, and like the name implies, sometimes messy approach to church. Kids are encouraged to enjoy crafts, games, meals, and a fun introduction to Jesus. And it's not just for the kids. The adults are always encouraged to join in as well. And not to leave us out here at Savannah, we're also doing something a bit different that we've never done before, at least not since I've been here. Starting tonight, right now, we're offering an evening worship service. It's not your traditional worship service from a Sunday morning. I'm standing right here wearing a Steelers jersey. It won't have the traditional music that we usually do on a Sunday morning. In fact, it won't have a few elements that you're used to. But my hope and my prayer is that it does have a place in helping someone experience worship that means something to them. Are any of these forms of worship less effective just because they don't look like what we do on a normal Sunday morning? And if the answer is that they can all be effective, then what does that mean for worship? Some of us do find truthful and spirit-filled worship in a traditional worship service, but some others don't. And if we, as a place of worship, only offer a service that fits that one shape and one size, quite honestly, I don't think that we're doing everything that we can do. And that's one reason why I'm so excited that our church has agreed to offer this different style of worship to complement our traditional Sunday morning services. And not only agreed, but I've already been hearing excitement and people looking forward to this new opportunity to come to church here. So if the style of worship isn't necessarily the most important thing, if it's not necessarily the order of things, if it's not necessarily the songs that we sing, and if it doesn't even have to happen in a building or in a pew, then maybe worship is something else. In our gospel reading, we may find an answer. In John chapter 4, verses 23 through 24, Jesus says, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is the Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." God is seeking worshipers that will worship him in spirit and in truth. In our earlier reading from Samuel this morning, God says to Samuel, "The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Let's go back to snowflakes for a second. We established already that what makes snowflakes unique is what happens to them on the outside, the forces they experience as they fall from the atmosphere. But what makes them the same? Because while snowflakes do differ in appearance, they also have some equally amazing similarities. Have you noticed that snowflakes are almost always six-sided? And if it's not a normal 6-point snowflake, it usually has 6 sides. So even those less conventional shaft-like shapes, we're still looking at hexagonal shapes. And there's a reason for that too. The shape that water molecules take on as they join together in their solid ice form gives snowflakes their shape. When these water molecules bond together, they take on a hexagonal shape, and that shape just continues to grow as more and more molecules join together. So what we see is really just a magnified version of what's happening all the way on the inside of that snowflake. Worshiping God should be the same. While each version of worship may look different on the outside, what is happening on the inside of worship should always look the same. God isn't seeking worshipers that come to church out of some misplaced sense of duty. He's not waiting for us to sing a certain hymn. He's not making sure that we recite things when we think we should. He's not checking to see that our bulletins have all the necessities. These are the things that people look at. These are the things that we expect to see and hear and encounter in worship. But God, however, is looking a little bit deeper than that. You could strip all of those things away and still worship God with your whole heart in the Spirit and in truth. He's seeking an honest and soulful approach to worship, and just like snowflakes that have a different approach as they fall to earth, so do we each as individuals have a different approach to worship. And just like snowflakes falling to earth, outside forces can shape what worship looks like for us. We saw that was true during the fallout of a pandemic. We see it sometimes over the winter when inclement weather or maybe a broken boiler stops us from gathering here for one reason or another. But regardless of how we approach worship, God is looking at our hearts. Are we going through the motions, or are we coming to God in truth, seeking to worship Him in the Spirit? Is our worship for outward appearance that people can see, or is it something that comes from our hearts? That one thing that must give worship its shape isn't found on the outside. God isn't seeking worshipers that feel they have to be here. He's seeking worshipers that have to be here. And that attitude is something that comes from inside, from our hearts where people aren't able to see, but God can. That attitude, the one that tells us that we have to be here, that's what God is seeking from us when we come to worship Him. So what is worship? It's like a snowflake. It looks different, just like we look different. Just like snowflakes are different. But regardless of how different it looks, every form of worship is the same at its core. At its core, it's about heart. What God can see and what people can't. So what are you bringing to worship? Are you here for the show, for what people can see? Or are you here because you have to be? Because your heart has to worship God? That is the worship that God is seeking from us. And when that is how you approach worship, then worship can come in just about as many forms as a snowflake, because at its core, your worship will come from the heart.